Hi, I'm Felicia Anderson, Director of Archives and History. The Baldwin County Commission feels it is important to honor and recognize the incredible heritage that we are part of. Hi, I'm important in understanding Baldwin County's story, its history, its identity, and in understanding our people. The title of this documentary is Baldwin County Heritage Families and consists of 4 segments using snippets of videos that provide an overview of the history of families that settled here more than 100 years ago. Now for part 4 in this 4-part series, Immigrant Groups.
For years after Alabama became a state in 1819, transportation depended on the waterways. The L&N rail line was completed across the northern part of the county before the Civil War, but it stopped at the Delta. Bay Minette became the county seat in 1901 after the rail bridge across the Delta was completed and rail access to Mobile became the best means of travel and shipping. Most early settlers came to Baldwin County by way of the railroad, which connected with all major cities in the north. Unrest in Eastern Europe led to a tremendous influx of immigrants to America. A group of Croatian settlers ended up near Perdido in Dias. Some of these came directly through Ellis Island. The Moravich descendants tell the story of their grandparents.
Hello, my name is Billy Sanders. My grandparents were Joe and Helen Moravich. They come over in the late 1800s, and my grandfather came first, and he worked in Arizona in the coal mines, and then later a guy from Alabama come out there selling property, and he ended up buying 40 acres. Well, Mr. Tony Pastorsich, a dear friend of his, come and bought the property, and later when my grandfather moved here, he quitclaim deeded it back to him. So this was around 1911 when they settled. My grandmother come over later in 1920. She had one daughter, Mary, that was about 9 years old or 10 when they come over. And then later on, they had 4 other daughters. They farmed, and they didn't know a lot about farming because my grandfather and Mr. Tony were stonemasons in Europe and Yugoslavia, so that's why they built the stucco or stone homes that are still standing. They didn't know a lot about farming, and they was asking neighbors when to plant peas, and they told them to plant them in dark nights. I heard this story later on, and they were out there in the middle of the night trying to plant peas, and then the neighbors had to tell them no, that they just planted, that was the moon had to be for a dark night. So, but they learned to farm, and they raised chickens and sold eggs, and Mr. Klasnich bought an old truck, and he would go to all the neighbors and pick up eggs and take them to Mobile and sell them, and then bring feed back to feed the chickens and stuff, or fertilize, or whatever anybody needed. So that's how they survived. But he built a real nice home that, like I say, that's still standing, that has huge timbers under it and with a basement, which is rare for this area, even though it does flood in the summer months at times. They come from a little town called Brebeard, Yugoslavia. My grandmother would tell stories of it when I was a child. She loved to reminisce about the old country and what they did. She never spoke English well, and as a child I learned how to speak Croatian to communicate with her, and she taught me how to count, you know, everything. So even, I still remember some, but not a lot of it. I could, if somebody talks, I can, you know, pick up enough to understand what they're saying. There was like 5 families on the road where I lived. There was a Pastor Sitch's, Mr. Tony and Miss Pastor Sitch was the first house on the left if you went down the road. And then Mr. John and Miss Plovanich lived on the first house on the right. And then next to them was Mr. George Plovanich and his wife. And then my grandmother lived on down the road, and my grandfather lived down the road about a quarter of a mile. And they there was probably 12 families total in the area. And they would get together and have cookouts occasionally. And I remember them killing goats and barbecuing them. They would do it all night and have a big feast the next day. They would do that in the winter, you know, when things were slow. But the picture there with the goats and the little shed was the corn crib, and it was the original house that my grandfather built. It was just a 2-room shack, sort of, till they built the house they lived in. So, and we stored corn in it, and he had kept corn to feed the mules. He had 2 mules, and I got to see them when I was a child. I was probably 3 or 4 years old and I remember the mules. And like I said, they farmed, they raised chickens, and we had milk cows, and they sold, you know, produce. As a child, we raised a large garden and sold peas and butter beans and corn, and you know, and then we put up a lot for the family to eat. We also sold milk by the gallon. It would be almost half and half, but I would take it on a bicycle and deliver it to the neighbors down the road for them to, you know, to drink. So it was just strained through a flour sack to get all the residue out, and it wasn't pasteurized or anything. It was just pure milk. So, and we farmed while I was a child. We had a cornfield, and we had cows and everything, and goats and odds and ends. Even had a horse at one time. But school, I went to the same school my mother did, which was in Rabun. It was the 1st through the 5th grade. There was 2 rooms. There was the same 2 teachers, Miss Lottie and Miss Lucy. Miss Lucy had the 1st and 2nd grade, and Miss Lottie had the 3rd through the 5th grade in one room. And they had a little lunchroom right, the room was like in a T, the school. They had a lunchroom, and we had lunch there. Learned the basic education there. But when I went to Bay Minette, I was way behind, and I really had to work hard to catch up because, you know, one teacher had 2 grades and the other one had 3, so it was kind of like a real small school. There was probably not over 35 or 40 students in the whole thing. So, and then I graduated from high school, went to Merchant Marines, and later come home and got drafted and went in the Army. And that's, but I still remember all the stories and stuff about the old country from my grandmother. And my grandmother was saying the reason my grandfather came over was there was a lot of unrest in the country, and there were civil wars going on, and people getting killed all the time, and he fled and went into another country and then come to the United States. And then later on she followed him here. But she would tell about how the stone building, you know, how they lived and everything. The way they got the land was, there was a guy from Alabama. My grandfather was in Arizona working in a coal mine, and he come out there selling property in Alabama. And from what I was told, the land was like 50 cents an acre. And these guys had money that worked in the mines because they'd saved their money, and Mr. Tony, who was a good friend of my grandfather, the two of them, they both bought a 40-acre section to homestead. And that's how they come to Alabama. They got the land and then eventually moved here, and they had money that they'd saved, and they built their homes and everything.
The Croatians in Dyess were not the only immigrants who were attracted to the bounty that was promised by salesmen. Land investors advertised widely, primarily throughout the Midwest. Many immigrants in the North were finding the winters harsh and wanted to buy their own farms, so most home seekers who came to Baldwin County were European immigrants who were already in America living in ethnic communities in the North. Such large numbers came from the North that Foley was actually nicknamed Little Chicago. A Polish immigrant store owner in Chicago, Victor Jervich, decided to retire to Baldwin County, but he was soon in business again. His grandson Jimmy remembers his story.
Hi, I'm Jim Jerkowitz. I'm a native of Baldwin County. I was born in Foley in 1936, and I'm here to speak about my grandparents who were Polish immigrants to the United States. And they were both born in Poland and moved at early age to northern Michigan. They actually came on a ship, and they didn't come together, but they came at separate times. My grandfather came to Port Austin, Michigan, and I think he might have had some relatives there, but he worked on a farm there, and that was he was 15 years old, and so it was like back in the 1870s. And he came there and he worked at this farm for a while, and then he subsequently moved to Detroit, and he lived with his aunt there, and he got a job in a foundry making railroad car wheels, and he worked there for a time, and then some time after that he started a business. Actually, I think it was a saloon business, and then he sold that to somebody, and then he worked or operated a candy store and a school supply business, and it was right across the street from a school. So he ran that business for a while, and I think then he subsequently sold it and built a bigger store in Detroit, and it was called a dry goods store, but they had all kinds of shoes and various kinds of things. It had a basement with a whole bunch of stuff down in the lower part of it. And I think he decided about when he was 39 years old or somewhere around then that he was going to retire. So Mr. Foley's Magnolia Land Company salesmen were going all around the North selling land to people. Well, he bought this 20 acres right out of Foley, which it was kind of way out of town then, but it's at the corner of Peachtree Street and Cedar Street in Foley, and that's where they came to Foley with 2 boxcar loads of belongings, and they stayed in town for a while, and they had actually brought two carpenters, timber frame carpenters from Michigan, because they were familiar with building barns and things. So they built a house on this property down, and that house is still standing, by the way. It's on the corner of Peachtree Street and Cedar Street in Foley. It's up close to the hospital. They built this. They built this barn, and it was put together with wooden pegs, actually. And it was the old style like they had in Michigan was a gambrel roofed barn. And then they built a house, and they came. My grandfather and his wife Martha, they had 3 daughters and 2 sons when they moved here, and they all lived out there and helped out on the farm. They worked there. Actually, they planted satsuma trees, and they harvested those and did other farming. And satsuma trees froze out, and I don't know what year that was. And then they got rid of those and planted pecan trees, and pecan trees are still there. So they worked. My grandfather sort of retired, and he didn't know really what he wanted to do. I guess then he decided he didn't want to be retired anymore. And they had bought some property in downtown Foley across from the Holmes Museum, which was like Wright's drugstore. And they sold that and decided to move to Somerdale because they thought it was a big growing place at the time. So they bought a store that was run by the Baldwin brothers, and the Baldwin brothers moved to Robertsdale. Anyway, they operated that same business for a while, and then in 1921 when they went to Somerdale, and they moved to Somerdale. They all lived right there in town, and kids all helped out in the store, and his wife helped out in the store, and she eventually, I think she died about 3 years after they moved there. But he decided he was going to build this nice building next to the other building, so they hired an architect, and they built this 3-story brick building, which is still in Somerdale, and it's now no longer a store. It's turned into an event center. But they operated this store, and my dad was in business with my grandfather, and they operated that for many years until my grandfather passed away. But they had catered to the agricultural people that were around, farmers, and sold that kind of supplies, fertilizer and seed, and they sold they ran this general store which had all kinds of stuff in it, just sewing machine needles to shoes and everything else. And they had a gasoline pump that Gulf Oil was the distributor up in Robertsdale, and they had actually, I think they originally started out with getting the gasoline delivered by the train to Somerdale. They would go over and get it in 55-gallon drums and pour it into the tanks. And they had one of those. I don't know, y'all probably have one here in the museum. It's a hand pump. It pumps up into a glass thing, and then they fueled up cars. All kinds of different things that they did. Ran a packing shed that my father did most of that business. Shipped out potatoes. And one year this was like in 1932. I remember they shipped out 320 carloads of potatoes out of that one shed. So, I've got, the books where they'd build them out. But they went all over the north to different places. Most of them went to Chicago. So, anyway, my grandfather and my dad worked at that business until my grandfather passed away in 1957, I think it was. He was 82 years old, and I ran the business myself afterwards for a number of years until we closed it down and turned it into something else. When my grandparents moved to Somerdale, don't remember them actually doing things that were Polish. My grandfather had some friends, that lived out from Somerdale, and they would come to the store. I remember them coming. They would sit there and speak Polish to each other, and he had lots of friends. He knew everybody in the country that a lot of people still remember him. And he'd sit there in the store and talk to salesmen and buy and sell things. But he had lots of friends, and there were several Polish friends because they come in there. I remember them speaking Polish. My aunt, who lived close by, she could write and speak Polish. My father, he could speak very little Polish, but he grew up, going to school from an early age, so he didn't speak Polish. But I do remember that they did have lots of friends around that were speaking Polish, and he could also speak German. There were a lot of people who used to come from Alberta over there, and he'd speak to them in German. And so my whole family went to church in Somerdale. Well, I guess when they first moved here, they went to St. Margaret's in Foley, which was just a little small church at that time. And then they went to St. Gabriel's, which was in Somerdale. And that church is now closed and consolidated into a church in Robertsdale.
Even though not actually on the rail line, the town of Alberta was only a short wagon ride away from Foley. Alberta is known for the German character it has preserved.
My name is Jeanette Frank Bornholt. That's a mouthful of German. I am second generation born here in Alberta. My father was first generation born. Both sides of his family immigrated in the early 1900s, ended up in Chicago, and then came south to Alberta about the 1920s in that time period. They came to what was the life planned by the Baldwin County colonization. They came and bought 55,000 acres and trying to entice a German settlement. Immediately they took off a 20-acre plot for the town. Everything else was broke up in 20 and 40-acre plots that they could homestead. They were sold on an installment plan, which is what my great-grandmother did. If they made a commitment to stay 6 months, they would actually clear 10 acres for them. This is what happened with my grandmother. And they had a little, like a one-room house, not even a porch on it, that the family lived in. It was a hard life. It wasn't easy clearing the land, obviously with pine trees. Anybody that's cleared any land would realize that. But a lot of them did forfeit and go back to the north. But my family stayed, and they learned to work hard and play hard, and that's what is so delightful about the town of Alberta being unique. The first generation, my father's generation, maintained as many of the old German traditions, and he certainly did not give up his beer and sauerkraut. In fact, the town of Alberta was the only town in the state of Alabama that could sell beer during Prohibition, and we're quite proud of that. Of course, the town's population probably tripled during that time period. And it's obviously today the carryover with our German sausage festivals that we have here in town twice a year. Years ago, the Alberta Farmers Club had built a huge hall and was dedicated with a great festival, and that was held annually in July and August. Of course, there are a lot of vineyards here. Scuppernong is still one of the favorites. Most homes in Alberta had a large vineyard. You had the Hagendorfers, the Langensteins, the Bartels, more close to Lincoln. And my grandma Frank was known for her good wine. Of course, the state of Alabama shut that down, so they resorted to more home use and smuggling. No, I guess bootlegging would be the word for it. I can remember Grandma taking gallon jugs of her wine, stuffing it in a gunny sack, and surrounding it with seed corn. And they'd stuff it in the trunk of her brother-in-law's car. When he went back to Chicago, he recycled it. So that went on during that time period too. The farms in Alberta were showcase farms. They took a great deal of pride in what they did. They were progressive. We had a citrus plant here where satsumas were grown, and they were graded just like you would a potato shed. It's a huge building in the town. Even today, if you ask someone a direction, if they're old-time Alberta, they'll give it in the old way. Bergman's Hill, which is right east of town. The building is still there. I think they made a pizza building out of it shortly. But you'd say it's up on Bergman's Hill. The Cakeley Motor is down east of town. Len's Motor was downtown. You know, you just went through where they were located. The old post office was south of Persky's drugstore, next to the Kaler building. So if you knew where those buildings were, you knew where you were going. That's how we still do it today. You had a tractor dealership with Herman Dagey and Herman Dagey's Hardware. Roy Morton was, I can remember him being vividly, and his building still stands west of town. We even had 2 theaters, actually 3 at one time. The old Colliers had a building downtown that was used for a theater, and it burned. And then we had the Lex Theater, and then we had a drive-in theater. And of course, the drive-in theater I can remember during my courting days, and I'm not telling you how old I am. We had the Alberta Locker Plant, which was a slaughter and a freezer plant that was operated by Alfred Stuckey, who also is the master behind the secret ingredients that go into the Alberta Sausage Festival, their sausage there. We had 2 two-story hotels with the balconies built downtown. One was built where the Little League Baseball Park is now, Peter Eichler. And then Adam Bretz built one downtown, and his floor was, dance floor was one of the best in the area because he had made it out of pine, and it was patterned with pine being creosoted, so it had the dark and the light pine in it. But it's supposed to be one of the best dance floors around. J.A. Pilgrim bought it later and renovated it into apartments, and that's about the time Bear and Field caved in, so it was full most of the time. We had several grocery stores, obviously, and it's always surprising when you think of how many grocery stores were in the little town of Alberta, but they all got along and they all did business. J. Miller Grocery and Feed and Baby Chicks. They always had baby chicks there. Uncle Johnny Miller was also the town's first mayor. And across the street was the State Bank of Alberta, which never shut its doors during the Depression. Another unique thing, but these German men who run it were very staunch about being loyal to their patrons. There was the Jensen's Grocery, which is just west of what is now Regents Bank, where State Bank was, and it is now designated a Baldwin County Historic Site because of the time of being restored as near as what it was my day, which is heavens knows how long. There were 2 barber shops, Beddoes and Bohops, and Miss Mary Walsh, who was the town's beautician. She was a lovely lady, single, very petite, always did everybody's hair the same. You knew you went to Miss Waltz to have your hair done. The west of town was John Zollicoffer. Everybody called him John Zoller. He was the town wells man. He drilled the wells, he repaired them. And my Uncle Laurie Frank worked with him. He was his brother-in-law. And he'd tell how Zolly would work with a pipe in his mouth. He smoked a pipe, and he'd just hold it between his teeth while he was working. And putting a well down in those days involved manual labor. I mean, this was hard work, weights and ropes and hoisting things up. And the story goes that a long metal pipe that they were hoisting up to hook to another one accidentally bumped the electric line, and John Zoller bit his pipe stem in two, and it went flying, and he had quite a jolt. Of course, we laugh about it now, but that could have been serious then. The town had a baseball team. My two uncles and my dad all played on it. It was well organized and managed and supported by Mr. Herman Dagey, who had the Dagey hardware store. Mr. Dagey was unique in himself. He had a large family. He had lost his arm up to his elbow in a sawmill accident, if I remember correctly. But I always admired him because that man could shovel with a scoop shovel more of that black coal or dirt off his dump truck than any able-bodied man. And how these men that played this ball team managed working all week and then Saturday and Sunday playing games. And they were pretty good. They were pretty good. It was a lot of fun. I can remember the field was up where the VFW is now. They had a bleacher stand covered because it was hot weather. And I can remember my grandpa standing up in the top bleacher yelling, "Come on, Chudge!" And he'd be yelling. He was a big baseball fan, Of course, Alberta can boast about several taverns. Alberta Tavern, which was run by the Schweitzers. That place was awesome. It was right across from the theater. The folks would drop us off at the theater. They'd go across and have a beer and dance. And they always had sandwiches. She made all kinds of stews and things. So it was truly a tavern in the sense of the German. Mr. Schweitzer was a violinist in the old country and a cafe, very well known. But during the war, he lost his finger on his violin hand, the important hand. He taught himself to do it with the left hand. And he would play on Saturday nights, and several old German, Mr. Himmert, I can remember Mr. Jaegert, Saltzman, a couple others, they used to play pinochle in the back room, but they'd get out with a few beers in them, and they'd sing those old German ballads. And you could hear them out in the streets, and it was just awesome. I can remember, it almost gives me chills thinking about them singing that. Of course, they sang some Mo ditties that we kids had to hurry and get out. We weren't allowed to hear, but that goes with a lot of that territory. We had Persky Saloon, Benny's place. Benny McCombs had an open fire pit that he made the best barbecue around with his. Of course, we had the infamous Alberta Social Club and its hamburgers. But we also had our churches. St. Bartholomew's Catholic Church was the church, one of the first churches with the Lutheran Church to settle in the town. They were the base. Other churches were like missions in Foley, Somerdale, but the main baptisms and weddings took place at St. Bartholomew. We had First Baptist and the Christian Missionary Alliance. These were all early churches. So they kind of balanced off the taverns. Two popular dance bands were out of Alberta, the Cybers and the Shears. They'd play on Saturday nights, all the dances or the weddings, New Year's Eve. In breaks, Irma Ulrich and my mother, Josephine, would play the piano. And I can remember my mother playing a beer barrel polka, and everybody would be out on the dance floor. That was a favorite. That was a favorite. To this day, it still is. There was actually an Alberta Glee Club that consisted of about 20 of Alberta men that competed. I went to New Orleans and placed pretty good down there. Can you imagine? That's awesome. We had two sawmills, Bruins on the extreme east, and of course the old sawmill, which is now a swanky subdivision going up just west of town. Alberta Farmers Club at one time was asked not to compete anymore in the county fairs because they always won first place. It was getting to be almost comical, but it's testimony to the farmers and their products because these displays showed all their best products and they were huge. I can remember seeing it. I miss that in the fairs these days, those Baldwin County fairs. The names of the folks in my hometown, they're like family to me. I mean, the Saltzmans, Alms, Keplers, Keeklers, Kleinschmidts, Shane. They all just, roll off your lips. Leiderman, Lindorfer. Don't they feel that German? You had the Mordens, the Keltzes, even town characters, Nick Grabbeldinger. I have a wonderful story I always tell about Nick Grabbeldinger, but I always ask if anyone's a descendant of his first before I tell it. And then you had Richard Jaegert. He was one of those little Germans that on Saturdays he wandered from tavern to tavern. And when you have 4 or 5 taverns in town, by the time he was wandering down the street, he was singing in German, the top of his voice, swaggering himself down the street. I can picture that little man to this day. Every town should have some town characters. And I could go on and on about it. But I guess I'm an endangered species, being a native of Alberta. But we still have pretty good and living, good life, good living. And that's my hometown.
Salesmen were also employed to meet newcomers to America. When the Salzman family ancestors arrived in America, they were identified by a salesman who recognized their native tongue of Swiss German.
Hi, I'm Frances Salzman Bush and my brother Paul Walter Salzman, and we are from Alberta, from the German community. The names of our ancestry would be Walter Salzman and Anna Salzman. They came here in 1912. They landed in Ellis Island. Grandpa came first into Ellis Island, and Paul, I'll let you tell a little bit about.
Well, I think he came originally through Canada. Yes, and the second time he came back with his bride would be when he came back through Ellis Island. And when he came through Ellis Island, he bought the land sight unseen in Alberta by a Jew that was selling to people the land according to what accent they had. If they spoke German or if they spoke Italian. If Baldwin County had these different communities, so they was selling them the land at that time, what they had.
Grandpa, when he went back, he came in, then he went back to get Grandma. When he went to get Grandma, Grandma had already left and married somebody else. So Grandpa decided to take her sister instead and came back to the States with his sister, and then they were married in New York.
But what really interesting is a few years ago, several years ago, I went back to the town that my grandfather was born in, and we stayed in that house that was built in the 1400s. And there's a little creek that divides the two towns, or the two communities. And they do not speak amongst each other because my grandfather came from the other side of the creek. And actually my generation, or when I went over there, they was talking. But when my sister went over, they wasn't even talking to each other.
They wouldn't even talk to me about the other side. It was kind of quite hard.
They was still feuding about him coming and getting them.
We know at least 3 brothers came from Switzerland, and they were Walter, Werner, and Emil. They all eventually came to Alberta, Alabama. Emil did not like it, and he went back to Philadelphia and ended up living there. Walter and Werner stayed in Alberta. Werner was a blacksmith and had a blacksmith shop in Alberta for years and years. And our grandfather, Walter, was a farmer. And he farmed for years and years and then passed it on to my father, and then he passed it on to Pop.
When he came over here, they came downhill and bought the land sight unseen. Then they walked 3 miles from Alberta out to the farmstead every day while they was building the house, what their original house. And during this time, they went broke. So he went back to Philadelphia, work as a baker, make some more money, come back and continue on with it.
And then in that time, my grandmother actually stayed in Alberta the second time.
He went broke the second time here. Then they only had enough money then for one train ticket back to Philadelphia. So he went back to Philadelphia, work as a baker, as she stayed here. Then as soon as he got some more money saved up, he came back. Then they end up with the chicken contract for the NAS in Pensacola. And whenever he had the contract for the chicken, the eggs at NAS, they became very well off for that given time. And then it rocked on to right before Dad was born, 26.
26.
When the war happened, they had during the war and through Prohibition when he lost the contract. But he used to spend 2 days to deliver the eggs to NSS.
Because it'd take him that long to get there.
Yeah, they put on a wagon, go across the Lillian Bridge. There wasn't a bridge deal, there's
a wooden one.
A ferry took them across.
Yeah, it was a ferry that
took them across. Yeah. Then he went to NSS, delivered the eggs, and then come back, and it took 2 days to make the round trip. And so since he had that contract, it's how they ended up making enough money to stay the second time around.
Walter and Anna Salzman only had one son, and that was our father, Aniel Joe Salzman. And she had problems having my father, so there was never any other one. So he was an only child.
Yeah, we think there was a child before him, but
did not make it. And Dad almost didn't. We had an older brother, Arthur Eugene, and he died of cancer 5 years ago. So he was our older brother. Paul took over the farming.
Yeah, well, actually, my dad sold the farm in '68, and I always wanted to farm, and he kept 40 acres. And when I got out of school, I wanted to farm, so I just had my dream, and I started. We had did very well over the years.
Well, it went from regular farming to turf farming.
But back to after they came over here, I think he became a citizen in 1917.
1917
is when he became citizen, and somewhere he had to go to Cleveland to get his citizenship, well, I understand it. At this time, when everybody in Hillsborough usually spoke German, so the neighbors, everybody agreed to, if they outside their home, they only spoke English. If they inside their home, they allowed to speak German. So what they did was they would make the deals outside on buying cattle or buying a horse or something, but they had to go inside to get all the numbers correctly, because that's how they learned to speak English, by being outside. Everybody in the community only spoke English outside. They would not speak German outside. They only did that inside their private home.
And my father, when he first started school, he couldn't speak English. And he went to a Catholic school, and there was a nun that could speak Swiss German, and she taught my dad how to speak English. And he started, learning more of the English. But I guess in the house, they only spoke German and Swiss German. And so Dad wasn't around the English part.
I have an old story. I don't know if it'd be interesting. I can exit out. And this is honest, a true story. My grandfather used to make a bunch of homemade wine.
Yes, he did.
And they had a root cellar where the wine was at. Well, he was kind of a character. So the gas man came out to bring the propane gas. He had, before he come out to get to fill up the tank, but before he got there, the Baptist preacher come out. He had a Baptist preacher down in the wine cellar, getting the Baptist preacher drunk. Then he had the gas man that was a deacon in the church, had him out in the chicken barn, getting him drunk. Then, after they all both got pretty well lit, he put the two together. the story goes that they end up being, they're all big friends anyway, but when a truck left out, it ran over his fence. So next day he has at the preacher's house, making him come out and set his fence back up. Ain't that how you heard the story?
Yeah. I actually forgot about that story.
That's a really cute story.
When Dad was in school, he actually rode a pony to school and home. And he left the pony in town at someone's home and then would walk from there to the school. But he did that every day. And that pony actually lived many, many years. I've forgotten.
All three of us
got to ride. We have pictures of us on Dad's pony.
Named Danny.
His name was Danny.
He was part of the family.
He was part of the family. And it was really sad the day Danny had to be put to sleep. But Danny was very old, and my dad couldn't be there when they did it because he had had him since he was a little boy, and there's pictures of him with his pony, and he just couldn't put him to sleep. But Danny he lived a long life, but he was very contrary too. If he didn't want you to ride him, he'd kick you off. He was a good pony.
Baldwin County really is a great place to live. Baldwin County is a place where people work to keep it the land of milk and honey. And Baldwin County is the home to newcomers and natives alike. Baldwin County is where we treasure our past and plan for our futures. We as a community share the responsibility to identify and preserve our history for future generations so that they will know what came before them. It is our hope that through this documentary, you reach out to others in your families to discover your heritage as well. Thank you for watching.